You're listening to the Faith and Other Oddities podcast, brought to you by the Raven Creek Social Club, where we talk about faith and other oddities. For questions, comments, or to be part of the conversation, join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, where you can find us at Raven Creek SC. Now for your hosts, Emily Dixon and Nathan Underwood.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Faith and Other Oddities, where we read the Bible and talk about it.
A lot of different things discussed on this show.
Yeah. So last week we were in Psalms,
Psalms 2.
Psalm 2. Yeah. So.
Yeah. And we're finishing that out this week because we kind of ran out of time last time, and so we want to go ahead and finish up Psalm 2, and we want to get back into 2 Samuel.
Yep.
But we wanted to show how this psalm was connected to the idea of the coronation of kings, specifically with King David being the ideal king and the one who presented the nation with what a king should look like, but also to point us forward with expectations for the Messiah.
Mm-hmm.
And that expectation of the Messiah was something that was very near and dear to the Jews at this time. And I think sometimes we forget that Israel was looking for a Messiah in the same way that we hope to see the Messiah. That
Mm-hmm.
this is not a hope or a desire that's limited to the Christian faith. That each religion, the ultimate aim is to see God's rule manifest in this person we as Christians call Jesus. But the Jews were really expecting the first advent of the Messiah to be this kingdom like David. Now we believe that it's going to happen in the second coming, and we're going to get to see all of these prophecies fulfilled at a later date. And this is the reason why they missed who Jesus was because they were looking for a king to rule over the nations like David did. So we've ended the last time we were talking about that concept of being born again and how that's not unique to Christianity. It was very present in Judaism, and how that verse there in Psalm 2, "Today I have begotten you," does not refer to Jesus. It refers to David and him being reborn as God's son when he took the crown, when he was coronated as a king. Now, as we move forward in verse 8, it says, "Ask of me, and I will make nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possession." So, number one, as a son of the king, he had the right to ask for anything and to ask specifically for nations. And David believed this. I mean, we've already seen this back when he went to Achish, the Philistine king. He actually went to that king and said, "Hey, give me a city." And now he's saying God has enlarged this. It's not just a city that like a Philistine king or, God, representative of the God, could give him. God could actually give him the ends of the earth as a possession. And we know that this is something that's going to happen with Christ. We see this reflected in the book of Acts, where we start to see that reversal of Deuteronomy 32, 8, and 9, where the nations were allotted to the sons of God, and they were appointed by their number. So now we have this time where David's saying, God's going to reverse this, and it is going to come through the means of kingship and God's rule over all the nation through his anointed king, through the Messiah. And now Rashi reads this as an admonition that David should pray before going into battle, which of course we did see him do in 2 Samuel, that before he faced the Philistines, he asked God, should I go up against the Philistines?
Sure.
So you can kind of see where Rashi gets it. And this idea is very much a part of the Jewish kingship, that the king should be submissive to God. And the reminder that the purpose of the kingdom is or the purpose of God's rule through this king is to specifically extend the kingdom in the manner in which God has decreed and anointed or appointed for the king. So verse 9, "You shall break them with an iron rod and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel." So the rule's going to be complete, and the overthrowing of these foreign dignitaries and kings and other nation, it's going to be devastating. because removing corrupt leadership is always brutal. So, verse 10. Now, therefore, O kings, be wise, be warned, the rulers of the earth. So notice the first, O kings, this is plural. He's talking to the kings of the other nation. This is not directed to the king of Israel. And then this is confirmed in the second line, O rulers of the earth. Verse 11, serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. And so these verses are seen as a proclamation of mercy, that if you pay attention to the warnings, if you understand that God is the only true king, then you can survive if you practice wisdom and if you serve the Lord. So Art Scroll actually translates verse 11 with serve the Lord with awe, not with trembling. And it's
Well, in the JPS it says rejoice with trembling.
rejoice with trembling. Yeah, that's ESV. Yeah,
ESV,
rejoice.
okay.
Yeah. And that seems so weird because
Very strange.
Yeah, but how do you subject yourself to God? By honoring the anointed king and understanding that God's authority and God's holiness should be awe-inspiring. It should make you tremble. And that's the appropriate response to a holy God. It is that trembling, but you rejoice because you recognize the only reason why you're in his presence is because you've sought his presence. And now, because you have sought his presence through the study and application of Torah, now you can rejoice because you're going to be saved. That's what the promise of Psalm 1 was. And when we know that Psalm 2 is built on Psalm 1, now we recognize that we need mercy, and mercy can be claimed when you stand in humility before him. And I think sometimes we forget that the two things have to go hand in hand. We need that sense and that understanding of how great our God is. And I think that's one of the things we've done a great disservice to God in how we've presented him in modern culture, that he's our best friend, he's our boyfriend, he's somehow tame. He's somehow safe. And God is not safe. God is never safe. And we're going to see a huge example of that as we move forward in 2 Samuel, because we're going to be talking about transporting the Ark of the Covenant and the Ark of the Lord and how dangerous that is. Now, because God isn't safe, God is merciful and he teaches us how to be around him safely.
Sure.
And so I sometimes think that, and this is a bad example, and I'm going to acknowledge that up front, but I think part of growing up as a farm kid and being around these animals that were so huge
Mhm.
and massive, and we understand what it is to have your life endangered by something that you cannot control. And so you learn how to deal with them safely. And
Sure.
that's
That's a good. I think that's a good example. I mean,
well,
it
I
makes
just don't want to
sense me.
equate God with like a bull, he's so much more than that. So, but it's that fine line of how do you contextualize this stuff without being disrespectful, and how do you say these massive truths without making them trite?
Right.
I think that's always going to be a battle. But speaking of battles, verse 12. And so in the ESV, it reads, kiss the Son, lest he be angry with you and you perish in the way, for his wrath is quickly kindled. Blessed are all those who take refuge in him. So I see you've got your JPS version out there.
I should get back to the mic, I suppose. This one says pay homage in good faith.
Okay. Another translation is seek purity. Now, as a matter of fact, the Art Scroll says, yearn for purity, lest he grow wrathful in your way, be doomed in a brief moment. His anger will kindle, his anger will blaze. Praises for all who trust him. So even if you go to like Bible Hub, which I use Bible Hub a lot when I'm looking at a single verse, because it'll give you just a list of all the English translations or a lot of the English translations. And you're going to see that they can vary wildly. There's a lot of debate. And it all comes down to how we translate one little word here, and the word is bar. Now, the ESV has chosen to translate it as sun, so the verse reads, "Kiss the sun." However, it can also be translated as pure, as reflected by that Art Scroll translation I just read, and the JPS. So, this argument, let's talk about it, because there is legitimate basis for translating it both ways. So, bar in Aramaic is sun.
Sure.
Ben is the word for sun in Hebrew.
Okay.
We already know that the psalm is written in Hebrew. That's undisputed. In
Gotcha.
verse 7, previous to this, we already had the word for Ben, the Hebrew word for sun. We already had that present. So it seems really weird that we would switch from Hebrew to Aramaic within the same psalm and totally change how it's read. And this poses some huge problems because there's accusations that are being made on both sides of the fence. So, okay. One of the arguments we're getting to what those accusations are in just a second, but one of the arguments for translating this as the Aramaic bar is that the idea that this command is being given to Gentile kings and nations, so therefore you would use Aramaic to communicate with nations that spoke primarily Aramaic. If this is the case, why do we just translate one word?
Yeah.
Why isn't the whole
I'm not tracking with that one.
yeah, and it I'm with you. That does not make sense to me. Now, Jerome, who was around 400 AD or CE, depending on how you wanted to note that, he notes in his translation that it could mean sun, but he chooses not to translate this word as sun. He actually goes with the Hebrew meaning of the word, which is purity.
Okay.
And we don't know how far back that it was accepted to translate this as purity rather than sun, but we do know that it really wasn't solidified as the standard translation as kiss the sun until sometime around the 16th century. So scholars have plunged deep into biblical nerddom in attempt to figure out the correct translation. The problem is the grammar isn't really good, and it's not entirely proper no matter which translation we go with, and there's problems with every proposed solution. Now, I tend to lean towards the side that there is a corruption in the text.
Okay.
Somewhere along the line, somebody had a typo, and we probably lost the original meaning somewhere way back in the pages of history, and I'm okay with that. When we look at outside sources to try to help us, like the Dead Sea Scrolls, that we find very little help. The Dead Sea Scrolls, as far as I could find on all of my searches, they cut off at verse 8, so you don't have this verse included.
Okay.
So that's kind of irritating. And the problems that we get is our Jewish apologists translate the word bar because it does have the legitimate Hebrew meaning of pure. And they say that Christians have corrupted the text by trying to cause this to reflect a Christian message.
Sure.
Now, Christians accuse Jewish translators of trying to obscure the messianic language of the psalm. So this has, led to some arguments and wrangling. And the problem is if we just focus on this one word, then it's really easy to neglect the totality of the message or the totality of the psalm.
Yeah.
And when we consider the whole psalm, both Christian and Jewish commentators agree that this is a messianic psalm. And the question really is it limited to the earthly Messiah David that everybody knew at this time,
Mhm.
or does it encompass a future concept of a Messiah?
Right.
And I don't see the arguments either argument and the solution to those arguments is being mutually exclusive. I think we've seen within the psalm, if you go back to the last episode, there is this duality where you're looking back and you're looking forward, you're looking at earth, you're looking at heaven,
Hmm.
and the
Hmm.
psalmist has presented these ideas in a very cohesive, intertwined way that should not be ignored. And so, for this reason, I think the "kiss the sun" translation is actually far more suspect, and I think it is actually a case of Christian interpreters and translators trying to push a New Testament agenda on an Old Testament document.
Right. Right.
And I think that we need to uh, I think we need to acknowledge that this happens. I mean,
Well, it definitely happens. I mean, and if we lose this one verse, we haven't lost anything really that makes a solid case for Jesus being the Messiah. So that's
exactly.
number one. But I also think you want to make clear that whenever you're talking about um, how you think these, we're reading the New Testament onto the Old Testament in an illegitimate way. I just want to make sure that we're saying, we're not saying the New Testament is invalid. We're just saying, you know, make sure you're treating the Old Testament correctly.
Yeah, one of the problems with arguing for a side or a cause is, at least for me, and I think this is true of others, is it's very easy to get caught up into overstatement and grabbing onto anything that
Hmm. Hmm.
proves your stance. And we've already seen how Christians have tried to take this psalm and impose even greater meaning on it than what was there. We saw that back in verse 7, where God says, "Today I have begotten you." And they want to try to apply that to Jesus, which doesn't work out theologically at all.
Right.
And so we know that this is a psalm that Christians have attempted to make say more than what's there. And the problem is when we start doing that, we start losing the message of what God did present to us, and we aren't respecting what God has decided to present to us.
Right. And then anyone who knows the other side of it, then you've just made everything else you say more suspect.
Exactly. So, if I had a say in the translation committee, I'm like, give in. Just go with the Hebrew reading because the rest of the psalm is written in
Hmm.
Hebrew.
Hmm.
Be consistent. Stop trying to make things say what you want them to say, and stop destroying our credibility by doing something like this. So I would go with the purity aspect. Plus, there's another aspect in this because we need to remember this particular psalm is supposed to be read in context or in concert with Psalm 1. And Psalm 1 is presenting this idea that peace, success, and happiness is the result of devoting one's attention and will to the study and application of Torah. And the study and application of Torah teaches us that we need to be pure. And this is how you're pure. And it's by following the Torah. And so when you put that into play and read this verse with the idea of yearning for purity as
Hmm.
being one of the admirable and the celebrated traits of the Messiah or for anybody else, then it fits because it's yearning for purity that helps you avoid the wrath of God. And it's reading and studying Torah that teaches you how to be pure. And so we find refuge in the Lord whenever we are doing what's pleasing to him and we experience personal blessing. And so it all just circles back, and we already know that we're supposed to circle back,
Hmm.
and this just adds to that process. And so just being respectful of the text, that's the big thing for me,
Hmm.
is
Hmm.
we need to be respectful of the text. And I think when we fail to do that, we miss out because we forget that God has a specific message he's trying to teach us, and that specific message is, "Hey, you need to know what I want so you can do it. And I've been very clear in what I want." And this isn't something that I'm saying your salvation rest on. Salvation is grace and faith, and it's not by works, lest any man should boast. But when you enter into that relationship with God, if it's a real relationship, then you want to honor that relationship. And part of the way you do that is by getting to know him. And how do you get to know him? By reading the things that he has preserved for us to learn about him. So that wraps up Psalms 2. And
Yeah, well, and I do want to say, yeah, and especially like you're talking about, being honest with the text, especially if you already get there where you want to go through other text. There's no reason to pile on something else.
right, right. How flimsy is our argument if this is what we have to do, is to do something that's kind of questionable, honestly.
Yeah,
And so, yeah.
yeah, and then you completely just undermine all of Origin's work. when you do this.
Right.
Or not all of it, but a large portion of it. The hex split took a while to compile.
Yeah.
Go look that up. That'll kind of blow your mind because he did that without a computer or a printing press or anything.
I have that. It's a mind blowing undertaking when you. Oh, I sounded oaky there. Undertaking. So, but okay, we're back in Second Samuel now. We're on chapter 6, and I just want to say this is a story that has fascinated me since I was a kid. I have probably read this story so many times, trying to understand it. And I always refer to it as the story of Uzzah, because Uzzah is he's the central character, from the sense he's the one that things happen to. So, if you don't know the story, real quick overview: David has remembered the ark, and he's going to bring it into Jerusalem. And Uzzah's the one who tries to keep the ark from falling out of the back of the cart that they're transporting the ark on, and God kills him. And that's what bugged me, because I'm like, he was just trying to help.
Yeah.
Why did God kill him? Why is God being so mean? You shouldn't be mean to people who are trying to help. And let me just say that shows my maturity level, and it showed my lack of understanding, because going back and revisiting the story as someone who's older, I find that it actually makes way more sense than I would have ever been able to understand as a kid or a teenager. So, this story, it is told in both Samuel and in Chronicles, and we're going to be spending a lot of time referring to the Chronicle account, because the author of Chronicles tells a much fuller story.
Okay.
The writer of Samuel tells the story in less than 24 verses, literally 23 verses. You have the whole story. The writer of Chronicles gives us 76 verses, so almost 3 times the number of verses for the same event. But again, 2 books written for 2 different audiences in 2 different times. And, we got to remember, hundreds of years have passed between the authorship of both these books. They were not written at the same time. So if Samuel was composed, at least in part, as a lot of scholars think, by Nathan and Gad, then the events were current, and the people knew what was going on, so they didn't need a lot of explanation.
Mhm.
Now, the audience in Chronicles, they're getting this book after the destruction of the temple, and they have never encountered the ark. The ark had been carried away before most of them were even born. And so he's writing for an audience that needs to remember that the splendor and the glory and the majesty of God as he was manifest through their nation. And the chronicler goes through great pains to illustrate that one fact. We were a nation. We had a governing body, we had a religious structure, we had forms and systems in place that you need to make a nation work,
Mhm.
and all of these things that give people a right to call themselves an actual nation. But more than this, he's trying to remind them that this national identity was something they could be proud of and could be reclaimed even in the midst of exile. Samuel's audience, they don't need that. They just need to be told why the exile is necessary,
Mhm.
and why it was almost unavoidable by the time it happens, because of what the Torah says.
Right.
So, first one, David again gathered all the chosen men of Israel, 30,000. So we got this simple, direct description. David gets 30,000 men together. First Chronicles 13, verses 1 and 2 gives us this whole list of people that David consults with, commanders of thousands and hundreds, every leader. And they tell David, if it's good to you and it's the will of the Lord, then you need to do it. And they say, let us send abroad our brethren to all of those who remain in Israel. Well, when you say, hey, let's send abroad for everyone who remains, this is saying, hey, we can do the same thing in our exile. We can send abroad for everyone who remains. So that this language is trying to build, in Chronicles anyway, is trying to build this expectation of if it happened once, it can happen again.
Mm-hmm.
And so they send out, according to Chronicles, people together, priests, Levites that are in cities and in pasture lands. And so you have this expansive list of people, but you also have geography, because in First Chronicles 13:5, they're supposed to go from Shihor of Egypt to the interests of Hamath. Now, this is the most expansive description of the land of Israel we find in all of the Bible. And it's really driving home that point. Israel was a great nation.
Mm-hmm.
Normally, when we're told about Israel, it's from Dan to Bashir. And then all of a sudden, the writer of Chronicles is saying, no, it was even bigger than that. And you want to be a part of this great heritage. And he's pulling out all the stops to remind the people that this greatness was the result of honoring God, specifically in the building of the temple. And the first step towards building the temple is getting the ark back home.
Mm-hmm.
And you've got to remember, too, that when the people return from exile, building the temple is the first project, the first national project that they embark on. So with Samuel, one and done, Chronicles, this great big list, and this expansive description of the geography. But you shouldn't let the shortness of Samuel's verse obscure the fact that you have a theological message even there. And it's in this one key bit of information. He gathered 30,000. This is the first clue that we're supposed to be connecting this story right back to 1 Samuel 4, because it was 30,000 Israelites who were killed the day that the ark was captured.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah. And it's fitting that we go back and incorporate that story into this retelling, because this was the last time that the ark was center stage, was when the Philistines captured the ark. So we're going to have a lot of crossover between Samuel and Chronicles, and then 2 Samuel and 1 Samuel. So it's probably, honestly, if you want to kind of boil down why in the world I didn't understand the story here in 2 Samuel, is because I did not know it should be connected back to 1 Samuel. And it's only when you put the two together that it begins to make a lot of sense. So verse 2, and David arose and went with all the people who were with him from Baal Judah to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord of hosts, who sits enthroned on the cherubim. This is the only time that the ark is referred to this way, but it's in keeping with the writing of Samuel, because God's identity is the God who leads the army. He's the God of hosts, the Lord of hosts.
Right.
Now, Baal Judah is a new name for Samuel. We've never heard this name before, but the writer of Chronicles does clarify for us that this is Kiriath Jearim. This is where the ark was left the last time we saw it in Samuel. So there is kind of a weird little thing there that I don't have a great explanation for, that why would the writer of Samuel change names from this town, unless it was written by multiple people or there was an editor at work. Now, the writer of Chronicles does include a unique name for the ark. And again, this is the only time you find this title, is whenever the writer of Chronicles references events, he says the ark of our Lord. So he's reminding the people, the ark of our God. The only time we find the ark referred to with any kind of possessive sense for the nation of Israel. So it's fitting that it's in Chronicles. Verse 3, and they carried the ark of God on a new cart and brought it out of the house.
That's interesting, because my ESV does not say the ark of our Lord.
Oh, really?
No.
Well, is that Chronicles or Samuel?
Samuel.
That's in Chronicles.
Oh, it's Chronicles. Okay.
Yeah.
I was like, whoa, that's
We're-
way different.
We're juggling
Okay.
books.
I know. I'm trying to keep up over here.
I know it's crazy. You should see the system in place at my house when I'm writing all this out. So yeah, okay. So verse 3, and they carried the ark of God on a new cart and brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which was on a hill. And Uzzah and Ahiah, the sons of Abinadab, were driving a new cart with the ark of God, and Ahiah went before the ark. So this is where the ark has been since Samuel was a boy, to kind of give a little bit of context. The ark was never even in a place of central worship while Samuel was alive. This is how long ago it was been. And when it was left at Abinadab's house, it was his son Eleazar who was consecrated to care for the ark, but this name is not mentioned at all in Samuel or Chronicles. So we don't know who these two new sons are. They're new on the scene.
Okay.
And we do know that these guys don't have any reason to plead ignorance on how to treat the ark, because not only have they lived with the ark in their house, evidently since they were kids, because they weren't even mentioned whenever the ark was dropped off, but they were also Levites. And so we're being set up here, and we should already be cringing a bit, because we know that you don't transport the ark on a cart. This is the wrong way. The ark is supposed to be carried by the priest. And we should be cringing because this is the way the Philistines transported the ark, not Israel. So if Israel and King David don't understand how to serve and honor God better than the Philistines, what condition is the nation in?
Right.
And and if David, who's supposed to be better than Saul, can only do as well as the Philistines did, then we're in trouble. And we're in trouble because of the one thing that 1 Samuel 4 teaches us: the ark is dangerous. That's why it was at Abinadab's house to begin with, because God had killed a bunch of Israelites for daring to look on the ark, not even to touch it, just to look at it. And so when Israel
people tend to get killed whenever this thing's around. Can we store this at your house?
Yeah.
Can you imagine? Conversation must have been interesting.
I'm having this flashback of a friend who asked if he could leave a bunch of knives at my house one time. I'm like, no, you take those with you. I don't know what you've been doing or what could be done. So yeah, but that's the thing. The ark was where it was because it had been proven to be dangerous, and it was dangerous only after it had been handled in this exact same manner. And so as a reader, you should pause and go, what in the world is David thinking? Because notice, he didn't talk to God. He didn't inquire of the Lord before he does this. He just goes out and says, hey, we're going to go get the ark. It's like a Sunday afternoon drive. Hey, this is great. But even more, he doesn't inquire of God. He consults with his military advisors on a religious matter. Okay.
Man. Oh, we could go some places with that idea.
This is not a good thing. We don't talk to the military to teach us about religious manners and matters. Now, the thing is, it makes sense from the perspective. I used to have a bunch of Army guys that hung out at my house, and I love them. And one of the things I really loved about them, they know how to get things done. They can tell you what the most effective, efficient manner to get things done is. They don't spend a lot of time, haggling over nuances. Let's dive in and take care of it. So for military advisors, how do you move something big and heavy? You put it on a cart.
Yeah.
I mean, so you can kind of see that this makes sense. But then, why didn't David inquire of the Lord? Is this some kind of hubris setting in, or is it just nonchalance that he thinks that he's I can handle holy and sacred things. I mean,
Or maybe his thought is, well, of course God wants us to get the cart. Why should we even ask him?
exactly. Well, and when David had gone into the temple before at Nov, he'd eaten the showbread, and God seemed to be okay with
Yeah,
that.
that's
So,
also true.
he doesn't seem to have any real reason to worry
He's got
about.
a track record of not getting struck dead for things like that.
Yeah, he really does, and which shows you how much God loves him. But the rabbis came up with an interesting solution, like they tend to do, and they said that David thought that the command to carry the ark on the poles by the Levites only applied in the wilderness journey, and now that they were in Israel, then it was okay to move it with a cart. So this is the reason why he made this mistake.
I never saw the sunset clause in there.
I didn't either, but the rabbis, they came up with some great ideas. Um, but while we're questioning David, we might also want to question what's his motive. Is this a politically savvy move that, let's establish this place of worship? I'm God's anointed, and if I put in the ultimate symbol of God's presence in my capital city, now you have to appreciate my position within God's kingdom, and all of Israel should unite behind me, and we can do away with any doubts and misgivings. Or is it real devotion and honor to God? These are questions that with David you have to ask, but I don't think there's ever really going to be a good answer. Uh, Walter Brueggemann, who again, you always have to say you love Walter Brueggemann
Hmm.
because he's just great. He suggests that David manages to hold on to both factors with personal authenticity, which resists choosing one over the other. So he's saying, David could actually have both things going on at play and be completely sincere about both motives. It
Yeah.
and I mean, and I can see that because sometimes doing the right thing is also the advantageous thing. And you would like to think you're just doing it because it's the right thing, but we're human and we still see.
Yeah. I mean, if doing the right thing helps, bonus, right?
Exactly. Well, and I see this in David's statement because in First Chronicles 13:3, David says, "For we neglected it in the days of Saul." So David gives this this little critique of Saul, but he also is implying that he can do better, and there's a desire to do better than Saul did.
Hmm.
And so this is y- it makes sense that he could look at, if I'm going to be a good king, then I do have to do better than Saul. And doing better than Saul means that I honor the things of God in a way that Saul didn't.
Right. Right.
So now the writer of Samuel has already connected us tightly back to 1 Samuel 4. And we're left to wonder if David is going to get away with making the same mistake that Phinehas and Hophni did when they used the ark as a good luck charm.
Hmm.
And so this is going to be what we're going through and trying to sort out. So, verse 5, David and all of the house of Israel were celebrating before the Lord with songs, lyres, and harps, and tambourines, and castanets, and cymbals. Celebrating is a good translation here. The ESV translators did a good job. Um, because it carries with it the idea of merrymaking, kind
Hmm.
of something frivolous. This is not rejoice. They are not rejoicing before the ark at this point.
Right.
Their partying is what they're
Oh, I
doing.
see. I see what you're saying. Yeah. As opposed. Yeah. I
Yeah,
got you.
and they're not honoring the magnitude of this event
Yeah.
at this point.
Yeah.
So this verse and in First Chronicles 13:8, they're very similar, but there is one big difference. The verse in First Samuel literally reads firewood instead of songs. If you look at the Hebrew there, which is it's like weird, they were celebrating with firewood and lyres and so kind of odd.
I mean, that's what I want at my party. Furwood.
Nothing makes it a party like some firewood. And so, um, and this is why a lot of translators, like the ESV writers did here, translators did here, they correct it by using First Chronicles as a reference
Sure.
point,
Okay.
because First Chronicles does say songs. And the thing is, the words are like one letter difference between songs and fur.
Okay.
And
Would well, I mean, there's that. Would fur would be used in any kind of incense making?
it possibly might, but we don't have any kind of anything else. And it seems weird that you've got this whole list of instruments and no reference to anything, like incense with it. So
Okay.
you've got, songs, cymbals, tambourines, castanets, and I mean, all of these instruments. The kinnor is listed. Um, but I honestly think based on, like I said, there's one letter difference, and the two
Sure.
letters are really, really similar.
Mhm.
And you actually have to add the word wood to Samuel to make it fir wood.
So that it would okay.
It would just be fir.
Well,
So they, as in the type of tree.
yeah.
And
All right. Well, okay.
yeah.
I think I've wasted too much of your time on
Oh,
that.
yeah.
Sorry. I was just curious.
Well, what's interesting is it shows how translators and scribes used other parts of the Bible to make sure that the corrections were correct.
Mhm.
And so they relied really on First Chronicles to be able to make this the right reading. Uh, so what could have happened? And there's two scenarios that could have happened, and I like to play out the scenarios because I think we sometimes forget that translating the Bible is a very human endeavor.
Mhm.
Copying the Bible is a very human endeavor. So, what's possible is that the person who wrote Chronicles or wrote Samuel did not have a copy of Chronicles to refer back to make the correction. And so they
You mean did you say translated?
well, translated, but this is probably a scribe. Sorry, a scribe who was just copying.
Okay.
Yeah, who was just copying the book of Samuel. He probably came across this where it said fur, and he didn't have a copy of Chronicles to look at and go, okay, what did they say?
Sure. Okay.
And he's like, well, it couldn't just be fir, so it needs to be fir wood, and probably thinking instruments made of fir wood, which is one translation sometimes you will find that is
Okay.
instruments made of fir wood. So, he added the other word because he didn't have that copy of Chronicles to help him with the correction, or alternatively, a writer of Chronicles was reading Second Samuel, realized that there's a typo here, and said, "Well, we're
Mhm.
going to write the right word when we write Chronicles."
Okay.
And so they took it back to song. So this is technically an error in the script. That's just all there is to it. The Hebrew meaning, the Hebrew word there is wrong in Second Samuel.
Okay.
And so now nobody get their knickers in a knot because the meaning of the verse is unaffected.
Mhm.
There was a lot of people, they were partying with everything they had access to. And so they want to have a good time and celebrate the fact that David is bringing the ark back into, or not back, but into
Into
Jerusalem.
Jerusalem.
So the next verse says, when they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah put out his hand to the ark of God and took hold of it, for the oxen stumbled. So we have two different names for the threshing floor. Samuel calls it the threshing floor of Nacon. In Chronicles, it's Kidron. And each name only appears in these verses.
Of course.
Yeah. So we
There's no good way to reference around it.
Yeah, well, and the point is, it doesn't matter whose threshing floor it is. The point is, the oxen stumbled. Uzzah put his hand out, and if you're reading this without context,
Well, I mean, and it could have been that the name of the floor had changed by the time Chronicles was written.
exactly.
So
Yeah, so we're going
it's
to refer to
pretty
it.
simple.
Yeah, going to refer to it by the name people know. Oh, wait a minute. Also, there's the fact that people in the Bible have more than one name. So
Mhm.
all of this stuff comes into play. But the point is that the part that matters is intact in both verses, and that's the oxen tripped. Uzzah reacts. He puts his hand out, and this seems like a perfectly legitimate response when you see something valuable start to fall.
Mhm.
What do you do?
You try to stop it. Okay. So I actually it's a little bit of personal. You actually have to. I mean, you have to train that reflex out of yourself.
Yes, you do.
I mean, in certain instances, I was not working with anything nearly so holy, but I used to work for the liquor distributor. And one of the things they tell you is if a bottle starts to fall, don't try to like catch it with your foot or your hand. Just back up.
Yeah,
Because if it breaks on you, it's gonna hurt you.
right.
And so seriously, that's a hard impulse
It really
not
is,
to go for.
because you have to bring in that conscious thought before the instinct takes over.
Mhm.
And that's not an easy thing. But in Uzzah's case, this has been something that's been housed at his father's home, and he's a Levite. And so, even though it's been a part of his life, he still hasn't learned the proper way. He hasn't bothered to train that impulse out of himself
Right.
regarding this.
He probably didn't work for the liquor distributor.
Probably not. Well, yeah. Okay, I'm not going
I know.
Yeah.
We can drive
So,
that joke into the ground real quick.
yeah, well, we can do that. We like to get our money's worth out of the jokes. But verse 7, and the anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah, and God struck him down because of his error, and he died there beside the ark of God. So the chronicler tells us specifically that the error is that Uzzah put his hand out to the ark. And so we read this though, and we get like, well, this is a really disproportionate response by God.
Right.
And if we don't have that full picture, it's easy to think that God's just being horrible. And as I've mentioned like 3 times already, he's a Levite, and he would have known the proper way to refer to the ark. At
Mhm.
this point, this information is available. We've talked about how maybe parts of the Torah or all of the Torah weren't available to the people during this time.
But this part was.
This part was, because David's going to access this information later on.
Mhm.
So this is not lost. One of the primary duties of a Levite is to make sure that the ark is treated with the proper dignity and respect that it deserves.
Mhm.
And instead of upholding his duty to God, he's bowed to the dictates and desires of a king. And it really drives home the point in Israel, you cannot confuse the king with God.
Right.
They are 2 distinct beings. And yes, they operate together, but the king is always subservient to the God.
Mhm.
And now, Uzzah, as a Levite, actually had an obligation to speak up and correct David in his error. And because Uzzah did not correct David's error became Uzzah's error. So this idea that when you know more, you're supposed to do better.
Yeah.
And he
Yeah.
had an obligation.
Okay.
And by joining, by joining in this and becoming a participant with David's error, he's actually inviting others to join and be a part of it. And because he's a leader.
Right.
And so he's giving his tacit approval of what David's doing by allowing it to happen. And the fact that he is at the head of the parade, this is seen as outright, absolutely, we should just follow along, because if our king and our spiritual leaders are doing it, it's got to be the right thing.
Right.
That's not how this works. So, in reaching out to the ark, he is doing a few things here. He's demonstrating a lack of faith. He's demonstrating a lack of understanding about the nature of the ark, but he could also be showing a sense of pride, and which kind of is strengthened by the fact that he is so close to the ark.
Mhm.
Now, if we go back and look at some basic beliefs about the ark, we find out that it was believed that the ark was not carried by the Levites. We believe that
There's a tradition that states
thank you. Yeah. The ark carried the Levites instead. So that if you carried the ark, you were actually being carried by the ark. And so, this isn't just a gold box with some putti on top. This is a gold box where
we should explain what putti are.
Yeah.
That's not really in the common vernacular. The little angel-looking guys in Italian art, those are called puto, or plural putti.
the baby angels,
The little baby.
the cutesy little,
That's not what a cherub looks like.
No, cherubs are scary.
Allegedly.
And I haven't actually seen one myself, but
So yeah, I wanted to
right?
Like, in case no one knew what putti was, that's not really,
Well,
you don't really hear that in conjunction with the Ark of the Covenant.
well, because often in modern culture, when we talk about cherubs, people think of those cute little babies,
Right.
and
No, and I
yeah,
followed you.
no, I know you did, but that's the thing when the Ark of the Covenant, when it's described as it has cherubim on top,
Hmm.
these are terrifying guardian attack angels of God that he's enthroned on.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think we need to remember this isn't just a symbol of God's presence with Israel. God's manifest presence, the Shekinah glory, this is where it was seen.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this isn't some kind of abstract, oh, look, we worship a God who's enthroned above the cherubs. Just squint real hard and believe, and you might be able to catch a glimmer. This would be an overwhelming thing that happened among the people.
Yeah. And that was before the invention of glasses, so
It-
some people wouldn't even have to
Squint, right? But I think we kind of, because we don't see manifestations of God like this, there's this tendency to forget how awe-inspiring this might have been, and what it must have been like to, the ark led the way through the wilderness,
Mhm.
and a cloud of a cloud by day and fire by night, and that was above the ark to demonstrate this is where God is and this is where he's taking
Mhm.
us.
Mhm.
And so we shouldn't think that this is something you're going to find at Hobby Lobby and put on your mantelpiece. This is more than that, and I think we're just too casual about the presence of God sometimes. But the idea that God might fall and that would be represented in the ark falling, it's
Mhm.
offensive.
Yeah.
And we should understand that it's offensive. God doesn't need humanity to save him. And that's what Uzzah was in effect doing. God needs humanity to save him. And the writer of both Chronicles and Samuel want you to remember what the significance and the purpose of this box is. I mean, they went out of their way to include 2 Samuel 6:2, the Lord of hosts who sits enthroned on the cherubim. 1 Chronicles 13:6, the Lord of hosts who sits enthroned above the cherubim. And so for anyone to think that this ark needed to be defended by a human being is a lack of faith at the very least, but it's arrogance at its worst. And we don't know what Uzzah's intent or his motives were. We can kind of guess maybe a little bit. Um, but God couldn't allow this act to go unnoticed or without some kind of strong response. And so we do get the strong response because without it, it could really have a devastating impact on the theology of Israel. And when you have this story, the theology is strengthened and validated that God is holy. And matter of fact, this story is so impactful that the rabbis actually embellished it just a little more to catch your attention. They said that when Uzzah fell down dead, that the ark actually hovered in midair for a while and returned to the cart on its own, because God didn't want anyone to mistake the even Uzzah's touch as being helpful. The ark did not need it. And we can't deny how much of an impact the story has, because anybody who's watched Indiana Jones and Raiders of the Ark, a Lost Ark, they understand that still it's very much within our cultural awareness today that touching the ark has consequences. And so we need to remember that this was God teaching a particular lesson and saying, you are not going to be disrespectful to me, and I am not reliant on humanity. Now, the rabbis were kind to Uzzah in the end, and we're told that he was one of the 8 people who was considered worthy to enter the world to come without any further purification. So, excuse me. So we do have the rabbis ascribing to him pure motives versus impure motives, and him merely being the means by which God teaches a lesson, which I thought was very interesting.
Yeah. I was looking through here, trying to find it where it is in Chronicles. I know you said it earlier, but I can never remember the numbers. But
13, I believe.
just wanting to compare some stuff. But go ahead with what you were saying. I'm sorry.
So David becomes angry at the Lord. Verse 8, it says, and David was angry at the Lord because he'd broken out against Uzzah. And that place is called Perez Uzzah to this day. Now, excuse me, the allergies are killing me again. I'm not convinced angry is the best translation here. The actual word for anger is not found in the Hebrew. I'm not convinced that angry is the best translation. The actual word for anger is not found in this verse. We have it in verse 7 previously that God is angry at Uzzah.
Right.
But here in verse 8, we just have vayachar versus vayakar, off. Off is the Hebrew word for anger.
Okay.
The way I remembered that in Hebrew class is off is angry, but it's also nostril. So out of anger, I knocked your nose off. So, I mean, things you do to remember languages.
I would be like ticked off.
Well, it's the idea.
That would be.
It's the
that would
the
be
nostril.
The easiest way for me to remember.
Right. Yeah, the nostril flaring. So we have verse 7, and his anger was kindled or burned, versus verse 8, and he was kindled or burned. And so the Talmudic argument is that without the word off, that this is more along the lines of dismayed or was distraught or was appalled.
Okay.
And so David's not angry of God. And I think where you have these back-to-back verses where you have the same idea, or the same kind of wording, similar wording, that if he'd meant the same thing, the writer would have
said the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense to me.
I mean, yeah, it seems reasonable that you should write what you mean to say. At
Well,
least to the best of your ability.
Right? And so I think there's some validity to the Talmudic softening of David's response. So I do find it interesting that the Art Scroll does add a parenthetical to this verse because it tells us that David's dismay was not directed at God, it was directed at himself. And so for this reason, David's reaction is interesting because the Lord had broken out against Uzzah. Now, just a few verses before in 1 Samuel 5:20, David had celebrated when God had broken out against the Philistines in battle.
Right.
And there was that place, Baal Perazim. Now we have Perez Uzzah. You hear the Perez in there, but that's broken out. So the two names actually have very similar names because they have that Perez in there, that they've broken out. So David goes from celebrating that God has broken out against the Philistines to lamenting and being appalled and dismayed that God's broken out against Uzzah. And we're reminded God doesn't play favorites.
Right.
If you are not doing what he's told, even if you're part of the covenant community, God is still going to enact consequences against you. And I think that's one of the things we talked about a lot when we looked at our previous episode with 1 Samuel 4. So the idea here is that the Israelites, as God's chosen people and as people who had access to this kind of information, they actually had a higher obligation and a higher responsibility to honor God than even the Philistines did. And we as Christians need to take that into account for how we respond to God. So verse 9, and David was afraid of the Lord that day, and he said, how can the ark of the Lord come to me? Not a lot of comments on David being afraid, but as I read this, the golden child, he's being reminded that God's only going to tolerate so much.
Right.
He's being corrected, but that was the point. You remember Psalms 2, the Son of God lives in that place. of divine love and discipline.
Mm-hmm.
And Brueggemann reads this as a positive. When here's what he has to say. He says, when people are no longer awed, respectful, or fearful of God's holiness, the community is put at risk. And
Seems reasonable.
isn't it? And notice the shift in David's perception and his attitude. And I was shocked that none of the commentators pointed this out. How can the ark of the Lord come to me? In this question, the ark is the active element. Previously, David was asking if he should bring the ark to Jerusalem. Yet now he's saying, the ark needs to come to me.
Mhm.
The ark needs to be the active component. So he's starting to get it. And he's remembering his obligation as a king to be subservient to God. And he's placing himself back in that proper position of obedience. And he's keeping his pride in check, and which is good because we all know what happens when David gets out of line. And this is the line that all of God's leadership has we have to toe.
Mhm.
You gotta have confidence to move.
Sure.
And to do the right thing, but you also have to
Have humility. Yeah.
Exactly. And so this is a time where David really has to find his confidence rooted in the commands of God. And I think that's what this episode overall is about. It's bringing David back to that place of humility so that when he acts on God's decree, it's not his own wisdom. It's not the wisdom of his generals. It's him saying, this is what God has dictated in his Torah.
Mhm.
These are the rules he's given us to exist by, both as a people and a nation. And this also is very much in alignment with what we saw in Psalms 1 and 2. It's a big cohesive piece of David's personality where he understands his success
Mhm.
is rooted in following God's dictates. And his life demonstrates this. His
Right.
Psalms proclaim this. And it's only when David gets too full of himself that we start seeing sin, we start seeing corruption, and we see him actually neglecting the people who should be under his care.
Yep.
So we'll succumb to allergy problems for this episode.
Yep. Well, yeah, it seems like a good place to stop, and we'll take a little break and probably start cooking dinner. But
Yay!
anyway,
Food.
so anyway, everyone, thanks for joining us. Hopefully you had a good time, and we'll be back next week with more of David, more of
Still got to finish Uzzah's story.
Still got to finish Uzzah's story. But yeah, I'll be excited to get into that and see where it takes us. But till next time, catch us on RavenCreekSC.com or Raven Creek SC on the social media to be part of the conversation, and we will see you next time. Bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to the Faith and Other Oddities podcast, a Raven Creek Social Club production. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. If you like what you've heard, please write us a review on iTunes or consider supporting us on patreon.com/RavenCreekSC. As always, thank you for listening, and don't forget to join us next week.